The cabin was quiet, broken only by the low thrum of the engines and the shuffle of passengers finding their seats. At the front of first class, Amara Dixon stood in the narrow aisle, her boarding pass in hand, staring at the woman occupying her seat. Seat 2A. The woman didn't look up at first. She was absorbed in her phone, her manicured fingers sliding across the glass with deliberate ease. Only when Amara spoke did she finally lift her head. "I believe that's my seat," Amara said, her tone calm but firm. The woman's eyes flicked over Amara, a quick scan that carried the weight of judgment. She offered a thin smile. "No, this is mine," she replied smoothly. "I always sit here." Amara raised the boarding pass slightly, holding it at chest height. "It's clearly printed." 2A. The woman, Victoria Hartwell, gave a laugh that wasn't warm. It was the dismissive sound of someone confident she would not be challenged. "There must be a mistake. I've been flying Pinnacle for years. I requested this seat." She said it as if her loyalty outweighed Amara's claim, as if preference could rewrite fact. Around them, other passengers grew still. Some pretended not to listen, their eyes fixed on screens or magazines. Others stole brief glances, curious but unwilling to intervene. The air tightened as if the whole cabin sensed a confrontation unfolding. Amara stood her ground. She was not dressed in the sharp armor of a business executive, no tailored suit, no statement necklace to announce her authority. Instead, she wore a soft cashmere sweater and dark jeans, clothing chosen for comfort. Still, her posture carried the quiet certainty of someone who knew her place in the world. Victoria mistook that certainty for arrogance. "Maybe you should double-check," she said, her tone slipping into patronizing sweetness. First-class seating can be confusing. Before Amara could respond, a flight attendant approached, moving quickly down the aisle. Her expression was brisk, the practiced look of someone accustomed to resolving passenger disputes. She glanced once at Victoria, then fixed her gaze on Amara. "What seems to be the problem?" Victoria answered before Amara could speak. "This passenger claims this is her seat," she said, gesturing lazily. "But I've already settled in. Surely there's another solution." The attendant nodded sympathetically toward Victoria, then turned back to Amara. Her voice softened, though the words carried weight. "Ma'am, perhaps we can de-escalate this. There are other available seats in the cabin. Would you mind relocating?" It was presented as a compromise, but it wasn't. It was a subtle shift, placing responsibility on Amara to yield, to bend, to keep the peace for everyone else. Amara stayed silent for a moment. She looked again at the boarding pass in her hand, then at Victoria, who was leaning back comfortably, lips curved into a small, triumphant smile. Her voice, when it came, was even and controlled. "This is the seat I purchased." The attendant offered another careful smile, one meant to smooth the edges of conflict. "Please, it would help everyone if you could be flexible." Help everyone. The word struck harder than intended. They suggested that Amara's insistence on fairness was selfish, that her presence in her rightful seat was disruptive, that yielding would be the noble choice. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. Some adjusted headphones, some kept their eyes fixed on phones, as though silence absolved them of responsibility. A man across the aisle leaned slightly forward, curious but unwilling to speak. Amara drew a slow breath. The pause stretched, heavy, with expectation. She could move, as she had done in countless other situations, sacrificing comfort to maintain order. Or she could stay, risking the discomfort of everyone watching. Her decision was not yet spoken, but the battle lines were clear. At 30,000 feet, a single seat had become a test of dignity, respect, and belonging. Stories travel fast. A headline flashes across timelines. Black CEO humiliates racist passenger, reveals he owns the airline. It feels good to read. It feels like balance has been restored, like the universe has finally delivered justice with precision and speed. Millions share it, not because it is true, but because it satisfies something deeper. People want to believe in quick victories. They want to believe that dignity lost in an instant can be restored just as quickly, that arrogance will always be answered with downfall. But that is the fantasy. The truth is slower, heavier, far more complicated. Consider the case of Dr. Brianna Hicks, a clinical pharmacist traveling to a professional conference. She was berated by a flight crew member for a baseless offense and forced off the aircraft. There was no instant reversal, no triumphant reveal. What followed was humiliation, missed commitments, and the long, exhausting process of filing complaints. That dragged on for months, or the group of black men who boarded an American Airlines flight, only to be escorted off before takeoff because a flight attendant claimed they carried an unpleasant body odor. No evidence, no medical concern, just a complaint born of prejudice. When the men protested, an airline representative admitted she did not disagree, with the suggestion that race had been the deciding factor. The passengers were left stranded, their dignity trampled in front of strangers, while the airline scrambled to manage its image. These are not anomalies. They are reminders that justice in the real world does not come with dramatic music or immediate consequences. Instead, it comes, if at all, after legal petitions, media scrutiny, and the draining task of proving what should have been obvious from the start. That bias, subtle or overt, dictated the outcome. Amara Dixon knew this reality intimately. She had climbed to the top of an industry where her presence was almost unthinkable. A black woman leading a global airline. Her very title challenged the unwritten rules of who could be trusted with authority at 30,000 feet. Boardrooms were her battleground long before this flight. In meetings with investors and executives, she was the only one of her kind more often than not. Her ideas were sometimes repeated by colleagues minutes later, suddenly greeted with enthusiasm after being ignored when she voiced them. When she pressed back against unfair assumptions, the labels followed. Difficult, defensive, hard to work with. Words that cut careers short when applied to people who looked like her, yet were praised as assertive when applied to her white counterparts. Research confirmed what she lived. Black leaders were far less likely to have their authority respected, far more likely to be questioned in public settings. The numbers told a story that her own life echoed. Success did not erase the skepticism directed at her. It only sharpened it. There had been a board meeting years ago, early in her tenure, when Amara had challenged a proposed partnership that undercut safety protocols. She remembered the silence that followed her objection, the quick glances exchanged between directors. A senior executive leaned back in his chair and, with a smile that held no warmth, said, "Amara, don't be so difficult. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." She had smiled in return, though her chest burned. The deal eventually collapsed under its own flaws, but no one circled back to acknowledge her foresight. The word difficult lingered in the air long after the meeting adjourned. Moments like those built the armor she carried into every room, every negotiation, every chance encounter where her legitimacy was silently questioned. It was the same armor she carried into this flight. That was why she dressed the way she did. Not in a suit that shouted her status, not in sharp heels or bold colors. She chose a cashmere sweater and dark jeans, simple, comfortable, unremarkable. To most travelers, it was a casual choice. For Amara, it was layered with calculation. Comfort was never neutral. For someone like her, comfort came with conditions. A white passenger in relaxed clothes might be seen as chic, effortlessly wealthy. Low-key. For a black woman, the same choice invited scrutiny. Was she professional enough? Did she belong in the premium line, in this seat, in this cabin? She knew the answer depended on who was asking the question. Every gesture, every expression, every silence carried the weight of those unspoken calculations. To the casual observer, she was another passenger. But beneath that exterior was the burden of knowing that she had to prove her place twice over. Once with a boarding pass, and again with the quiet dignity of not letting the assumptions of others dictate her next move. This was the lived reality beneath the viral myth. The fantasy of swift revenge promised a cathartic ending, a dramatic reversal that silenced prejudice in seconds. But Amara's story was not fantasy. Her story was the truth of what it meant to carry authority in a world determined to question it. And that truth was about to play out, seat by seat, in a cabin full of witnesses who would rather look away than confront what was unfolding in front of them. Amara's boarding pass was still in her hand, steady, undeniable. She raised it again, this time holding it closer to the attendant who stood between her and the seat. "This is mine." 2A. Her tone was not loud, not pleading. It was firm, restrained. the kind of steadiness that comes from years of practice. Victoria Hartwell leaned back against the headrest, arms folded loosely across her chest. Her lips curled into the faintest smirk. "These tickets are all the same to you people," she said. The words were slipped in casually, almost lazily, as though they weren't meant to sting. But they landed in the quiet cabin like a slap. Amara did not flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on the attendant, refusing to give Victoria the satisfaction of a reaction. But the insult hung in the air, thick and undeniable. The flight attendant, Anya Volkov, shifted slightly, adjusting her stance as if to steady herself. Her voice, trained to be pleasant, cut through the tension with a measured calm. "Ma'am," she said to Amara, "I understand this is frustrating, but perhaps we could de-escalate. There are other available seats. We can find you something just as comfortable." Just as comfortable. The phrase was supposed to sound like a solution, but it was not. It was an instruction to yield, disguised as a compromise. Amara's gaze didn't waver. "I paid for this seat. It is mine." A murmur ran through the nearby rows. Nothing spoken aloud, just the rustle of jackets, the shifting of bodies pretending not to listen. Passengers glanced down at their phones, screens glowing in their hands like shields. A woman in the aisle seat of row 3 pulled her cardigan tighter and fixed her gaze on the safety card in front of her. A man in row 4 coughed, too loud, the sound betraying nervousness. N01 spoke up. Victoria adjusted her handbag on her lap and gave a quiet, triumphant laugh. "It's really not that serious," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I've been flying this airline for over a decade. I'm sure the crew will handle this properly." Properly. The word carried the same sting as appropriate, a reminder of who was expected to belong and who was not. Amara drew a breath, slow and controlled. She looked at Anya once more, still waiting for fairness, for recognition that rules were rules. And the boarding pass was plain. But the attendant's polite expression did not change. "Mrs. Hartwell has already settled in," Anya said, her voice soft but firm. "It would help everyone if you were flexible." Help everyone. The phrase echoed in Amara's mind. The request was not for fairness, but for convenience, for calm, for the maintenance of comfort for those who were watching but would never intervene. Her silence stretched for a moment. The air was thick with unspoken expectation, the weight of eyes watching her choose between dignity and surrender. She lifted the boarding pass again, this time extending it fully toward Anya. "This is not about flexibility. This is about what I purchased. This is my seat." For the first time, Anya's practiced smile faltered. She glanced at the pass, then quickly back at Victoria, as though the paper itself was an inconvenience. Victoria scoffed, shaking her head. "Look around," she said. "Does this really seem like the kind of mistake that happens in first class? Let's be honest." The implication was sharp, undeniable. Women like Amara did not belong here. Not in this cabin, not in this seat. Amara's fingers tightened around the boarding pass, but her face remained composed. She did not give them the satisfaction of visible anger. The silence in the cabin deepened. Passengers shifted again, restless in their avoidance. A young man in row 5 lowered his eyes as if studying his shoelaces. A woman across the aisle adjusted her headphones, though she hadn't turned them on. The whole cabin seemed to fold in on itself, willing the confrontation to vanish without requiring them to speak. Anya tried again, her words careful, her tone rehearsed. "We can offer you an aisle in row 3. Extra legroom, complimentary service, and I'll make sure you're looked after personally." The offer was polished, but the truth was raw. Amara was being asked to give up what was hers, simply to ease the discomfort of others. Her response was quiet, steady. "No. 2A is mine." The firmness in her tone sliced through the cabin. It was not loud, not angry. It was simply undeniable that Victoria's eyes narrowed. She leaned forward slightly, her voice low but cutting. "You're making a scene. That tells me everything I need to know. Everything I need to know." Words chosen to brand Amara as the problem, to cast her as disruptive, unreasonable, unworthy of the place she claimed. The air was heavy with silence, each passenger complicit in it. Their stillness was louder than words. Amara remained standing, unyielding, her boarding pass still outstretched. The seat was hers. The silence surrounding her said otherwise. Liam Carter sat 2 rows back, pressed against the cool leather of his aisle seat. From where he sat, the confrontation was impossible to ignore. The raised voices were not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the quiet hum of boarding. He saw the black woman standing in the aisle, boarding pass in hand, her posture calm but unyielding. He saw the white woman lounging in the seat, her arms folded in smug defiance. He saw the attendant, voice soft but biased, suggesting that the woman with the ticket should move. Liam's stomach twisted. He knew what he was witnessing. It wasn't confusion over numbers or a simple oversight. It was a test of dignity unfolding in real time. His hand slid into his jacket pocket, fingers brushing the edge of his phone. He hesitated. Record or stay silent? He glanced at the passengers around him. A businessman 3 seats ahead shifted in his chair and stared hard at the floor. A woman across the aisle scrolled furiously on her tablet, pretending the scene didn't exist. A young couple whispered to each other, eyes flicking nervously between the 2 women at the center of the storm. Everyone saw it. No one wanted to acknowledge it. Liam's phone was in his hand now, screen glowing faintly. His thumb hovered over the record button. He thought of the risks. Would the crew confront him for filming? Would passengers glare at him for making it worse? Would people dismiss him later as just another man seeking attention online? But then he thought of the alternative, doing nothing, sitting in silence as bias played out a few feet away. He knew the shape of this silence. He had seen it before. Silence was easy. Silence protected the one who chose it. Silence allowed the injustice to settle, unchallenged. The woman in the aisle, Amara, stood with a quiet steadiness that unsettled him. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't pleading. She was simply holding her place. Boarding pass extended like proof that fairness was supposed to mean something. And yet, fairness was slipping further away with every second that passed. Liam felt his pulse quicken. His hand trembled as he angled the phone discreetly, framing the standoff through the narrow gap between seats. His reflection flashed briefly on the screen, pale and nervous, before the camera settled on the image of Amara. Standing tall, he pressed record. The sound of the cabin seemed sharper in his ears once he started. The rustle of jackets, the coughs, the click of a seatbelt, the faint, dismissive laugh from the woman in 2A, the careful, coaxing tone of the attendant asking Amara again to move. Liam captured it all. He told himself he wasn't interfering. He wasn't stepping in. He wasn't forcing himself into the story. He was only documenting, preserving evidence of something that might otherwise vanish into silence. But even as he held the phone steady, he felt the weight of his own hesitation. Recording was safer than speaking, safer than standing, safer than drawing every eye in the cabin. Still, his heart pounded with the knowledge that this was more than a seating dispute. He had covered enough news stories in his years as a freelance writer to recognize the subtle shape of injustice. It was here, raw and unfiltered, playing out in front of passengers who pretended not to see that a woman in row 4 shifted in her seat, her lips pressed tight. She caught Liam's eye for a moment, then quickly looked away, as if embarrassed to be caught watching. A man with a laptop open on his tray tapped furiously at the keys, his shoulders stiff, his body language screaming discomfort. The cabin was full of witnesses, but silence carried the day. Liam's phone shook slightly in his grip. He adjusted his hold, steadying it against his chest. His thumb brushed the stop button, but he didn't press it. He couldn't. The longer he recorded, the more he understood that silence was not neutral. Silence had weight. Silence gave permission. That he swallowed hard, keeping the camera steady, and told himself that if nothing else, there would be a record that one woman had stood her ground, and another had tried to take what wasn't hers, while authority sided with convenience instead of truth. The footage might never leave his phone. It might never matter, but at least it would exist. Liam lowered the device slightly, his hand still trembling. He said nothing. Around him, the cabin remained frozen in quiet complicity. And yet, beneath that silence, something had begun to shift. Victoria. Hartwell's patience snapped. Her voice rose just enough to cut through the murmurs of boarding passengers. "You're making a scene," she said, her words sharp, rehearsed. "This is all for attention." Amara stood still, her ticket still in hand. She didn't respond. Her silence was not weakness. It was survival, the discipline of someone who had long learned that every reaction would be judged more harshly than the offense itself. But Victoria wasn't finished. Her lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. I've seen this before. People like you always think if you push hard enough, someone will give in, hoping for some kind of payout or special treatment. It's transparent. The insult spread through the cabin like smoke. Passengers shifted, uncomfortable, but still no one spoke. A man 2 rows back muttered something under his breath, shook his head, and went back to staring at his phone. Amara's fingers tightened slightly around the boarding pass. For a flicker of a second, the exhaustion showed in her eyes, the kind of fatigue that comes not from one confrontation, but from a lifetime of them. She blinked once, steadying herself, and when she looked up again, her expression was composed, unreadable. Victoria leaned forward now, pressing the advantage she thought she held. You people are always looking for a fight. The words landed like a thunderclap. Audible gasps broke the silence. A woman across the aisle covered her mouth with her hand. Someone else whispered, "Did she just say that?" The mask of politeness Victoria had worn so carefully was gone. Her bias was naked now, unvarnished and undeniable. Amara remained motionless. The weight of centuries seemed to press against her shoulders in that moment. Centuries of being told, in words or in silence, that her presence was conditional, her authority temporary, her right to belong always subject to review. The air in the cabin shifted. The tension was no longer just between 2 passengers and a flight attendant. It was now a collective reckoning, every witness forced to face the ugliness they had been trying to ignore. Anya, the attendant, looked shaken but still did not intervene. Her mouth opened as if to say something, then closed again. The training manual she had memorized had no script for this. Amara exhaled slowly. The breath carried not anger but weariness, the bone-deep fatigue of someone who had been here before, too many times, in too many forms. At the bank, in boardrooms, at the gates of her own company headquarters, her face did not break. Her voice did not rise. But the silence that followed was louder than anything she could have said. It was not about a chair. It was not about a boarding pass. It was about history. About who was told they belonged and who was told they must constantly prove it was. About the unwritten rules that whispered through every interaction. That power looked a certain way, that authority sounded a certain way, that dignity could be dismissed with a smile and a slur. Amara carried all of it in that silence, and the cabin seemed to feel it too. Liam's camera shook slightly in his hand, but he kept recording. His chest was tight with shame, not because of what Amara had done, but because of what he and everyone else had not. Around him, passengers shifted in their seats, stealing guilty glances, each one aware that they were witnesses, and that silence was no longer neutral. Victoria, sensing the attention, tried to recover. Her tone softened, but the venom remained. Look, no one wants this to get out of hand. If you could just move, we can all relax and get on with our flight. Her words were met with silence. The faces around her no longer looked away quite as quickly. A few passengers stared openly now, judgment plain in their eyes. The arrogance in Victoria's posture wavered, but she held the seat, clutching her handbag tightly, as if it were proof of her right to be there. Amara's voice came. At last, low but firm. "I'm not moving." The simplicity of it silenced the whispers. Her words were not a plea, not an argument, not even a challenge. They were a fact, grounded and immovable. The cabin held its breath. Victoria's eyes flashed, fury and disbelief colliding. She had expected surrender, as so many before her had. She had expected compliance, an apology, anything that would confirm her belief that her claim mattered more than Amara's truth. Instead, she was met with calm refusal. Injustice thrives not only in shouts but in silence. For minutes, this cabin had been a perfect example, but the silence had begun to fracture. The insult had been too raw, too clear. The balance was shifting, even if no one dared to say it aloud. Amara remained standing, her shoulders squared, her expression steady. The boarding pass was still in her hand, and her dignity was still intact, though the exhaustion in her eyes told the deeper story. This was the breaking point. Amara did not raise her voice. She did not match insult with insult. Instead, she slipped her phone from the pocket of her sweater and pressed a single contact. Her hand was steady, her face unreadable. The cabin was hushed, every rustle and cough swallowed by the silence of anticipation. Victoria shifted uneasily in the seat she had claimed, clutching her handbag a little tighter. Anya, the attendant, hovered with a tight smile that no longer looked convincing. A click, then a calm voice on the other end of the line. "Caleb," Amara said. Her tone was composed, unhurried, almost gentle. "It's Amara. Hold flight 411. Inform the crew the CEO is waiting." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of shock traveled through the cabin. For a moment, the silence seemed endless. Then Anya froze, her eyes widening as if the meaning had taken a second to register. The polite authority she had clung to dissolved instantly, replaced by confusion, then dawning panic. Victoria blinked, her smug posture faltering. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. The confidence she had wielded moments before evaporated, leaving her suddenly small in the wide leather seat she had refused to leave. Passengers shifted again, but this time it was not avoidance. This time, the silence was heavy with realization. The woman they had silently doubted, silently judged, silently abandoned, had just revealed she was not merely a traveler. She was the one whose name sat at the top of the organization chart. The one who could decide the fate of everyone aboard. The intercom crackled, the captain's voice filling the cabin. His tone was steady but unmistakably deferential. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Miller. We have received a directive from corporate leadership. Please remain seated as we address the situation." There was no mistaking the weight behind his words. The authority Anya thought she had wielded was gone. The seat Victoria thought she owned was no longer hers to defend. Close-ups. Amara lowering her phone with quiet composure, her face serene. Anya frozen in place, eyes flicking between Amara and Victoria, her body tense with recognition of the mistake. Victoria sinking back against the headrest, the arrogance slipping from her face, replaced by something she had not expected to feel on this flight. Fear. Amara did not gloat. She did not smile. She simply stood with the same calm she had carried. From the beginning, her ticket still in her hand, the proof she had never needed but had held on to anyway. Her power was not loud. It did not come in shouts or accusations. It was institutional, undeniable, greater than a seat number. Passengers who had once looked away now watched openly. A man in row 4 whispered something under his breath, his tone reverent. A woman, near the window, blinked hard, as if processing what she had just witnessed. Liam kept recording, his camera trained on the stillness that had settled after the storm. Anya finally spoke, her voice brittle. "Ms. Dixon." But she could not finish. The title Ms. itself sounded hollow. Everyone knew who she was now. Amara's gaze was steady, but not cruel. "I'll take my seat." She stepped forward, calm and deliberate, reclaiming 2A without haste. The leather creaked softly as she sat, the sound amplified in the silence of the cabin. Victoria shifted violently, pressing herself against the armrest as though proximity alone might burn her. Her earlier confidence had dissolved into a flush of embarrassment. The handbag in her lap trembled slightly in her grip. No announcement declared her wrong. No apology was demanded. The reversal was complete without spectacle. The authority she had mocked was no longer theoretical. It was living, breathing, seated beside her. The passengers around them understood it too. They had witnessed not an outburst, but a revelation. Amara was not a woman demanding respect. She was the architect of the system itself, the one who defined the terms of belonging at 30,000 feet. The intercom clicked again. Captain Miller's voice carried a final note of clarity. "We are cleared for departure once leadership gives confirmation." Leadership. The word hung in the air, redefined. No longer a faceless authority on the ground, but a woman sitting in 2A, her quiet presence heavier than any command. Anya backed away, her posture stiff. She did not meet Amara's eyes. Victoria stared straight ahead, her chest rising and falling quickly, her earlier bravado gone. Liam's camera lingered on Amara's profile as she looked calmly out the window, the reflection of clouds framed in the glass. To anyone glancing at her now, she was simply another passenger preparing for a flight. But everyone on that plane knew otherwise. Her dignity had not been restored in a moment of revenge. It had never been lost. What had been revealed, instead, was the fragility of the arrogance that had tried to deny her place. This was the catharsis. Not explosive, not loud, but restrained, deliberate, and absolute. When the cabin settled again, Amara did not lean back. With a smile, she did not look at Victoria, nor at the attendant who had stood against her. She placed her phone back in her pocket, smoothed the cuff of her sweater, and exhaled slowly. There was no victory lap. No triumphant declaration. A few minutes later, once the captain confirmed clearance from the ground, Amara stood. She walked to the galley at the front of the cabin, her steps even, her expression unchanged. The murmur of passengers rose behind her, speculation filling the silence she left. Anya, stiff and uneasy, followed. Her face was pale now, the certainty she had carried gone. The purser joined as well, lips pressed thin, bracing for what they expected would be an angry tirade. But Amara's voice was steady. "This conversation stays here," she began. Her tone was firm, deliberate, free of emotion, yet carrying absolute authority. What happened was unacceptable. It will be addressed, not through embarrassment, not through rumor, but through formal channels. She let the words settle. Neither attendant spoke. This company will not tolerate behavior that strips dignity from its passengers. "I won't tolerate it," she continued. "You will be part of a process to correct this. Not as scapegoats, but as participants in a reform that should have been in place long ago." The crew nodded quickly, relief flickering across their faces. They had expected rage. Instead, they were met with accountability wrapped in restraint. When Amara returned to her seat, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted again. Passengers still whispered, still exchanged glances, but the spectacle was over. What lingered was something deeper, a recognition that the woman in 2A carried a kind of power most had never witnessed up close. The story, however, did not end in that cabin. The next week, a memo reached every employee at Aries Global. "Our commitment to equitable travel is not a statement for marketing, it is a mandate for practice. Effective immediately, we are launching a full review of customer-facing policies to ensure every passenger is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of race, gender, or appearance." The words carried her signature. They were printed on breakroom boards, emailed to inboxes, and discussed in training sessions. It was not a vague promise. It was a directive. A few days later, a press release followed. Aries Global will introduce a comprehensive implicit bias training program for all crew members and staff. This program is designed not as a checkbox, but as a sustained education initiative to address the systemic factors that contribute to unequal treatment in travel. The company partnered with cultural competency experts and civil rights advisors. Workshops were rolled out in hubs across the country, with crews required to attend sessions that dissected real incidents, not watered-down hypotheticals, but documented encounters where bias had shaped outcomes. The message was clear. What had taken place on Flight 411 was not an isolated error. It was part of a larger pattern, and patterns demanded systemic correction. Conflict resolution protocols were rewritten as well. No longer would attendants be instructed to de-escalate by moving the complaining party aside, a practice that had quietly punished those already wronged. Instead, procedures required crew to verify claims impartially, to check boarding passes, to record interactions, and to resolve disputes transparently. Supervisors were tasked with auditing those encounters, and follow-up reporting became mandatory. Accountability was no longer optional. For Amara, the choice not to humiliate individuals, but to reshape the institution was deliberate. She understood that firing one attendant or publicly shaming one passenger would satisfy the appetite for a viral headline, but it would not fix the currents beneath. The viral myth that had inspired countless stories, the CEO standing, revealing ownership, and banishing the offender, was seductive because it ended quickly. It gave audiences closure in seconds. But Amara knew the real power lay in slower, less visible work. The kind of work that endured after the headlines faded. Her personal indignity had become the spark for systemic change. Within months, flight crews across Aries Global spoke differently to passengers. Disputes were handled with checks and verifications, not assumptions. Reports were filed and tracked. Leadership monitored compliance closely, with Amara herself chairing quarterly reviews. To ensure progress, the transformation was not dramatic, not cinematic. It was procedural, deliberate, measured. And yet, It reshaped the company from within. Passengers noticed too. A black couple flying from Chicago to Paris reported being greeted with courtesy they had not experienced before. A Latino family traveling, with children found attendants offering assistance without condescension. Stories began circulating, not of humiliation, but of professionalism, fairness, and care. Each small shift was evidence that the message had taken root. Amara never mentioned Flight 411 publicly. She did not recount the confrontation in interviews, nor allow it to become her defining anecdote. Instead, she let the reforms speak for themselves. For her, the seat had never been the point. The point was the institution, the structures that decided who belonged and who didn't. By reshaping those structures, she had ensured that the next passenger facing skepticism would not have to carry the same burden alone. This was the quiet aftermath, not spectacle, not revenge. Reform. The true story was never humiliation. The true story was accountability, systemic, enduring, undeniable. Liam sat at his desk that night, the glow of his laptop lighting the darkened room. The recording he had captured on Flight 411 played on loop. Amara standing calm, ticket in hand, while Victoria's words cut through the air. The trembling in his own hand was visible in the frame that he hesitated before clicking upload. He knew this video would not shatter the internet or climb trending lists overnight. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't staged for spectacle. But it was true, and truth mattered. The clip found its way into corners of online communities where similar testimonies lived. Stories of bias, of humiliation, of resilience. Liam's recording became one more data point in a chorus that was steadily growing louder, a chorus of witnesses refusing to remain silent. For him, the act was less about going viral and more about being accountable for choosing courage over complicity. Justice is not the burden of one. It is the responsibility of many. Amara had carried her part through restraint, through institutional reform that would outlast the flight. Liam carried his part by refusing to let the silence of that cabin remain permanent. Passengers who had once looked away were reminded that silence had weight. Each bystander, each witness, each leader faced a choice: allow injustice to settle quietly or add their voice, their action, their influence to the fight for equity. The story of Flight 411 was not about a seat. It was about who gets to belong, and who is told they must earn belonging over and over again. And it was about how ordinary people, passengers, staff, leaders, communities, decide whether to look away or to confront what is plain before them. And we've just watched how one moment of bias escalated until a woman was told, "You people are always looking for a fight." Those words echoed through the cabin like a thunderclap. Many of you know this feeling, whether you've lived it yourself or seen it unfold in front of you. Maybe you've been dismissed, overlooked, or silenced. Maybe you've been the witness who wondered whether to speak or to stay quiet. That I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a moment like this or seen someone else endure it? Share your story in the comments. These testimonies matter, and together they build a record that can't be ignored. If you believe stories like Amara's deserve to be heard, subscribe to Echoes of Black. By joining this community, you help amplify hidden voices and ensure these stories aren't lost to silence.